Wasn't there some speculation that she was on Epstein's yacht at one point in time? There was like photos with her and Prince Andrew way back in the day when she was like...
Jack Corrigan, sitting behind his microphone in a converted warehouse studio outside Austin, paused mid-sentence, looked down at a printed photograph on his desk, and said nothing. For a podcaster who filled 3 hours a day with opinions, 11 seconds of silence was an eternity. His producer, watching through the glass, later said it was the longest pause he'd ever seen Jack take on air. Then Jack looked up at the camera and said, "I think we need to talk about this photo." Within 6 hours, that clip had 11 million views. Within 24, it had crossed 40. And somewhere in a quiet Los Angeles suburb, according to two people close to the situation, a phone rang at 6:40 in the morning and did not stop ringing for the rest of the day. This is the story of how one photograph, one podcast, and one very famous woman's carefully built public image collided, and what happened when the collision refused to end. Isabel Hart had weathered a decade of scrutiny most people couldn't imagine surviving. Before she married into the royal house of Oldenburg and became the Duchess of Lynmouth, she had been a working actress. Well-liked, moderately famous, never quite a household name. Then she met Prince Edmund at a members-only social club, and within 18 months she was a duchess, a mother, and one of the most photographed women on earth. The tabloids had thrown everything at her. Stories about her family. Stories about her staff. Stories, endless stories, about whether she was difficult, whether the marriage was strained, whether the palace resented her. She had survived all of it with a combination of expensive lawyers, careful media strategy, and simple endurance. By the start of this year, Isabel believed the worst was behind her. The tabloid cycle had moved on to other targets. Her charitable foundation was thriving. She and Edmund had settled into a quieter, more private life on the American West Coast, mostly out of the direct line of royal watcher fire. Then Jack Corrigan found a photograph. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what Jack Corrigan actually was. He wasn't a tabloid reporter. He wasn't a royal correspondent chasing an exclusive. He was something the old machinery of celebrity management had never quite figured out how to handle. An independent broadcaster with a bigger daily audience than most national news networks, who answered to no editor, no advertiser board, and no publicist. His show, The Corrigan Hour, had built its reputation on long, meandering conversations that occasionally wandered into territory no cautious journalist would touch. He'd interviewed scientists, comedians, conspiracy theorists, and senators, often in the same week, often without much apparent editorial judgment about which of those conversations mattered more. Critics called him reckless. Fans called him fearless. Both were probably a little bit right. Jack had taken shots at Isabel before, nothing especially cruel, mostly the kind of skeptical jabs he aimed at anyone he considered overly polished. He joked a few years back that her charitable ventures felt more like brand extensions than genuine causes. He'd been dismissive of a televised interview where she described feeling uncomfortable with certain aspects of public life, suggesting she'd chosen that life and ought to own it. None of that had really hurt her. It was noise. Podcast noise evaporating within a news cycle. The photograph was different. It arrived, according to Jack's later account, from a documentary researcher named Vivian Cole, a real if minor figure in his story, an author who had spent years investigating a private members club called the Marlowe Club, a discreet, invitation-only network with locations in half a dozen cities, catering to entertainers, financiers, and minor aristocrats who wanted to socialize away from public view. Vivian's research wasn't really about Isabel at all. It was about the club itself, about how membership clubs like the Marlowe Club functioned as informal matchmaking engines for the ultra-connected. How a single well-placed membership director could quietly reshape someone's entire social trajectory by deciding whose path crossed whose. Buried in Vivian's files was an old photograph, a young woman who closely resembled Isabel, years before she met Prince Edmund, standing on the deck of a yacht in the Mediterranean, alongside a man who closely resembled Edmund's disgraced cousin, Prince Leopold, a royal who had, years earlier, been quietly exiled from public duties after his own association with a financier later convicted of serious crimes. Vivian was careful, in her own writing, to hedge everything. The resemblance was strong, but not confirmed. The date on the photograph was uncertain. She had never definitively established the identity of either person. She sent the material to several outlets. All of them declined to run it, citing exactly those uncertainties. Jack Corrigan did not decline. It's worth being precise here, because precision was the one thing missing from how this story spread. Jack did not say on air that the photograph definitely showed Isabel. He held it up, described it, and asked a question. Does anybody know who this actually is? Because if it's who some people think it is, we have some questions to ask. That distinction, assertion versus question, mattered enormously to Jack's legal team and mattered almost not at all to the internet. Within hours, clips were circulating with captions that dropped every head Jack had included. Jack Corrigan exposes Duchess Isabel Reed 1. The photo that proves everything read another, despite the photo proving nothing definitively at all. Jack, to his credit, or depending on your view, as part of a deliberate strategy, didn't walk the story back. Over the following weeks, he returned to it repeatedly. He interviewed Vivian Cole for 2 hours. He brought on a body language analyst to examine the photograph frame by frame. He speculated at length about the Marlowe Club's membership director, a man named Damien Cross, who had, this part genuinely was well documented, introduced Isabel to Prince Edmund at a club event years earlier. Jack's core rhetorical move was consistent throughout. He rarely stated anything as fact. He asked questions. Why was Isabel invited to exclusive events before she was famous enough to warrant them? What was her relationship with Damien Cross before he introduced her to Edmund? Why hasn't anyone definitively confirmed or denied the identity of the woman in this photograph? Each question was, on its own, reasonable. Stacked together, night after night, they built something that felt very much like an accusation without ever quite becoming one. A structure that made the story almost impossible to legally challenge and nearly impossible to definitively rebut. People close to Isabel described the reaction inside her camp as controlled panic. Her communications team had a playbook for tabloid stories, a mix of legal threats, friendly press counter-narratives, and strategic silence. But that playbook had been built for an era of editors and publishers who could be reasoned with, pressured, or occasionally sued into caution. Jack Corrigan didn't have an editor to call. He didn't have advertisers who'd blink at controversy. His show had survived platform disputes before and come out with a larger audience each time. A cease and desist letter, several advisors reportedly argued, would only prove to Jack's audience that the story had teeth. So Isabel's team chose silence. No comment, no confirmation, no denial, no acknowledgement that the story existed at all. It was, in the short term, the least bad option. It was also, several media strategists later noted, exactly the outcome Jack's format was built to exploit. An unanswered question, repeated often enough to a large enough audience, starts to function socially like an answer, not because anyone has proven anything, but because silence reads, to a casual observer, as an admission that the truth is uncomfortable. The presence of Prince Leopold in this story added a particular kind of gravity that ordinary tabloid gossip never had. Leopold's fall from public life had been genuinely serious, a scandal involving his friendship with a disgraced financier, years of quiet distancing by the royal family, an eventual, humiliating withdrawal from all official duties. Any suggestion that Isabel had crossed paths with Leopold before she'd ever met Edmund didn't just threaten her reputation. It threatened the entire narrative the royal family had constructed around Edmund's marriage. The story of a modern prince marrying an outsider for love, breaking from stuffy tradition, bringing fresh air into an old institution. If that outsider had, in fact, been circulating in exactly the kind of elite social network the family had spent years trying to distance itself from, the fresh air story collapsed into something closer to history repeating itself with better public relations. That was the implication Jack never quite stated and never quite needed to. His audience filled in the rest. Away from the podcast microphones, the truth, as it usually is, turned out to be less cinematic than either the accusation or the outrage. Vivian Cole's research, when finally examined by an actual forensic imaging specialist hired by a British newspaper months later, concluded that the resemblance was almost certainly coincidental. Metadata on the photograph placed it several years earlier than the club researcher had estimated, a period when Isabel was documented, through work records and interviews at the time, to have been working steadily in another country entirely. The man in the photo, on closer analysis, did not match Leopold's known features from that period. The newspaper ran a single measured story. Viral Duchess yacht photo, likely misidentified, analysis finds. It got a fraction of the attention the original speculation had. Jack Corrigan mentioned the finding once, in passing 3 weeks after his initial episode, sandwiched between an unrelated conversation about a boxing match and an interview with a chef. He did not revisit it at length. He did not apologize. His audience, by that point, had largely moved on to the next controversy, though a considerable number of people, based on comment sections and online forums, continued to reference the yacht photo, as though it had been confirmed. It would be easy to end the story with a simple moral. The photo was probably a coincidence. The podcaster moved on. No real harm done. But that ending misses what actually happened here, which was more structurally interesting than any single mistaken identity. What the story really demonstrates is how a specific kind of media format, long-form unedited, framed as just asking questions, can generate enormous public damage without ever making a single falsifiable claim. Jack never said the woman in the photo was definitely Isabel. He never said Damien Cross had definitely engineered her introduction to Edmund for some hidden purpose. He asked. He speculated. He let an audience of millions draw its own conclusions, and those conclusions spread far faster and stuck far longer than the quiet correction that eventually followed. Isabel's team faced a genuinely difficult problem. Responding to speculation validates it. Ignoring it looks like guilt. And there is no third option that reliably works against a media figure who doesn't need traditional gatekeepers' approval to reach an audience. Damien Cross, for his part, gave a single brief statement months later, noting that his job had always been introducing people who might get along, nothing more sinister than that, and that he found it strange to be treated as a suspect for doing his job well. Vivian Cole, to her credit, publicly acknowledged the imaging analysis and updated her own published research to note the likely misidentification, a correction that traveled, as corrections always do, to a small fraction of the people who'd seen the original claim. Isabel Hart went on with her life. The foundation kept operating. The marriage, by all outward signs, remained intact. The internet, eventually, found something else to argue about. But somewhere in the archive of a podcast studio outside Austin, that 11-second pause remains, a small, strange piece of media history. The moment a question, asked confidently enough, in front of a big enough audience, briefly became almost as powerful as an answer, whether or not it ever deserved to be.